bit later on in this hour. 516-620-3602. Just say the WBAI Transmitter Fund that you would like to pledge. Send your dollars to the WBAI Transmitter Fund. It's 5 o'clock. Coming up next, 5 o'clock Shadow with Robert Knight.
This is 5 o'clock Shadow on the Pacifica Radio Network, originating at WBAI. I'm Robert Knight in New York, and today we continue our coverage of the Global Symposium on the Medical Consequences of Fukushima at the New York Academy of Medicine. The event was convened by the co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Dr. Helen Caldicott. But first, this breaking news. Earlier today, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission upheld its license denial for the Calvert Cliffs nuclear reactor in Maryland, not for safety reasons, but on grounds of foreign ownership. The decision is the first time in history the NRC commissioners have upheld the denial of a license for a commercial nuclear reactor, and only the second time a license for a commercial nuclear facility has been denied. In a 7-page decision released earlier today, the commissioners denied Unistar Nuclear's request to review an Atomic Safety and Licensing Board denial of a license issued in August of 2012. The board found that the project would be in violation of the Atomic Energy Act, which prohibits foreign ownership, control, or domination of an American nuclear facility. Unistar is wholly owned by Électricité de France, which is itself 85% owned by the government. Calvert Cliffs Unit 3 was to have been deployed with a reactor manufactured by the French firm Areva, which is also 85% owned by the French government. Michael Marriott, the executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, said, quote, "On this second anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the NRC commissioners have provided the public with a rare bit of good news. Of course, the commissioners really had no choice. The Atomic Energy Act is clear. Foreign ownership of a U.S. nuclear reactor is illegal." And he continued, "In any case, the reactor was never going to be built. It could not overcome the failed economics of nuclear power in general, nor the enormous cost overruns and delays being experienced by projects in Finland and in France." He said, "No one wants to build a reactor like that in a deregulated market like Maryland. Indeed, with this decision, Maryland's future is clear. It will be based on clean, renewable power and not dirty, dangerous, and expensive nuclear reactors," end quote. That from Michael Marriott, the executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. This is 5 o'clock Shadow. I'm Robert Knight in New York, and we now continue our coverage of the medical and ecological consequences of the Fukushima nuclear accident symposium at the New York Academy of Medicine, where the following presentation on the Japanese perspective on nuclear power was outlined by Aikiya Matsumura, the founder of the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders, in a talk titled, "What Did the World Learn from the Fukushima Accident?"
Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to express my thanks to Helen and the New York Academy of Medicine for organizing this timely event. to take this opportunity to express my deep appreciation to the many participants who have worked so hard to increase public awareness of risk of Fukushima. The realm of nuclear science must be linked to political action. So we are here today. I have worked at the United Nations and other international organizations in London and New York for 40 years. And I have attended many international conferences, starting with the UN Population Conference in Bucharest, Romania in 1974. Over the years, we have discussed in public, private, what you might consider the defining issue of the 20th century. Population, environment, social-economic issues, disarmament, women, children, and democracy. But we never discussed how one accident in a nuclear power plant could affect our lives for several hundred years, or how we lack a permanent nuclear waste repository, one that could store our spent fuel rod for 100,000 years. Discussion to political system and human rights now seems short-sighted when compared to potential nuclear disaster that could affect our descendants perhaps 20,000 years. 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, humans were building tools in the Stone Age. Can you believe? I worry about the growing risk to children who are being continually exposed to radiation. Many of the children will suffer from infectious diseases, and many will develop thyroid, lung, or breast cancers sometimes in their lives. According to Harlem, over 1 million people have died of these diseases as a result of Chernobyl accident. Others here have said that Fukushima so far has emitted more radiation than Chernobyl. In my two visits to Japan last year, I asked the party leaders I met their thought on the unstable state of the reactors and the thyroid cancer risk in the children. Few had any idea of the spent fuel rod or of their high level of radiation, or they sat 100 feet up in a damaged structure. Fewer still were thinking about public health. Undoubtedly, some politicians are aware of the potential catastrophe or reactor number 4. However, they showed their surprise when I told them that reactor number 4 has 10 times more cesium-137 than Chernobyl released. 5,000 times what the Hiroshima bomb released 7 decades ago. They couldn't hide their shock when I told them that all of the spent fuel assemblies at Fukushima Daiichi contain 85 times more cesium than Chernobyl, and 50 to 100,000 times what released on Hiroshima. I thank Bob Alvarez for making these important calculations. I knew we had found the right message when we shared the article on our blog, it was read more than 1 million times in just a few days. These same politician leaders wonder why they had heard none of this from TEPCO. Last April, Ambassador Murata and I met with Osamu Fujimura, who held the powerful position of Chief Cabinet Secretary. He assured us he would convey our message to Prime Minister Noda before he met with President Obama on April 30th. Both leaders might have discussed Fukushima at their private meeting, but the idea for independent assessment team and international help for the disaster were not mentioned publicly. This was a mistake. The government's first responsibility is the security of its citizens. But instead of reaching out to the independent scientists, they only consulted the TEPCO, focusing on minimizing the public relation fallout instead of nuclear radiation fallout. In any country, government and industry will keep sensitive information close after disaster, but Japan's actions have been near autocratic. Because of the government's unwillingness to share accurate information, Japanese citizens must rely on scrutinizing press corps for any useful information about the accident. Unfortunately, as with the politician, I found the journalists in Japan to be complacent and clueless. There is an amazing disconnect in Japan between the reality of Fukushima and the fictional image of the public has in mind. The press has failed in their job to close this gap. Japanese reporters, with several exceptions, have refused to investigate or ask the hard question about Fukushima. The New York Times Tokyo Bureau Chief Martin Fackler provides a thorough look at the media club mentality and the aversion investigation in his excellent book, Credibility Lost: The Crisis in Japanese newspaper journalism after Fukushima. I think you should read this. To be sure, the government has not made their job easy. TEPCO says when and what information will be released, like when the site will open to the press, when the long video of accident would be released. The accuracy of government medical report is in question. But without anyone to ask those questions, the public is left behind, smoke screen operating on half-truth. The public has lost sight of the most urgent need with regard to Fukushima. Its effort to end nuclear power in Japan are inspiring but missed mark. The protests are a result of fear, frustration, uncertainty. Prime Minister Abe will guide Japan forward with continuing dependence on nuclear energy. He will continue to restart Japan's nuclear reactors. Of all the politicians I spoke with, he was least receptive to my message of the danger for the country's children or of reactor number 4 spent fuel rod. I feel sad that we must wait for the sacrifice of tens of thousands of children to come to light for the public to realize disaster at hand. I am surprised that one group has not taken forceful action. spiritual root of Japan sit firmly with respect for the natural environment. The Shinto, Buddhist influence in Japanese life have bestowed a sacred importance on the country's natural beauty and resources. Japan's environment has not known a bigger threat than presented by the 4-damaged reactor at Fukushima. The country's spiritual leaders should be active in reinforcing the country's concern toward ongoing risk. We can see that Japan is ill-equipped to handle the ongoing problem of Fukushima. But this is more than Japanese problem. It has and will affect all of us. Are we doing enough? For the past 2 years, I have been warning of the potential catastrophe of reactor number 4 and the cancer crisis awaiting for our children. There are 4 major areas of concern that could cause a bigger disaster. Number 1, in reactor number 1, number 2, and number 3, complete core meltdowns have occurred. Japanese authorities have admitted the possibility the fuel may have melted through bottom of the reactor core vessels. It is speculated that this might lead to unintended criticality, resumption of the chain reaction, or powerful steam explosion. Either event could lead to major new releases of radioactivity into the environment. Number 2, reactor 1 and 3 are site of particularly intense radiation, making those areas unapproachable. As a result, reinforcement repairs have not yet been done since Fukushima accident. The ability of these structures to withstand a strong aftershock earthquake is uncertain. Number 3, temporary cooling pipes installed in each of the crippled reactors pass through rubble and debris. They are unprotected and highly vulnerable to damage. This could lead to failure of some cooling system, causing overheating of the fuel. Further fuel damage with radioactive releases, additional hydrogen gas explosion, possibly even zirconium fire, fuel melting within spent fuel pool. Number 4, reactor number 4 building and its frame are seriously damaged. The spent fuel pool in Unit 4, with a total weight of 1,617 tons, is suspended 100 feet or 30 meters above ground. Typical plans to remove the spent fuel rot in the coming years, but if there is another massive earthquake nearby, this may not be fast enough. If this pool collapses or drains, the resulting blast of penetrating radiation will shut down the entire area. These plans represent unprecedented international security risk. I view this as the problem for human civilization. Have I been overestimating the potential catastrophe? Your calculation tell me there is much higher probability of another disaster than one might think. So why are we allowing ourselves to take such a large risk? Allowing our future depends solely on chance or goodwill of TEPCO or Japanese government. And if another earthquake and further meltdown are indeed possible at Fukushima, I must ask What so many Japanese leaders ask me, why does the United States stand by silently? It's in the United States interest to take public action. High quantity of radiation reaching the West Coast would ruin our food crop. Geopolitical tension that would arise after such a disaster, ensuing evacuation would strain already difficult relations in East Asia. And finally, we are vulnerable to similar threat at home. A similar disaster could happen in the United States or elsewhere in the world with a nuclear reactor or temporary spent fuel storage facilities. There are more than 400 nuclear power plants online today, more than 100 of which are in the United States. Several sit near fault line, others are old. And then there are the 24 temporary spent fuel storage facilities holding rods like those suspended above reactor number 4. Many are only warehouses. Building a nuclear power plant might be rocket science, but maintaining the function of a cooling system is not. Yet these systems are so delicate and prone to failure. As we have seen in the last months at Fukushima, something as simple as a corrosion of a pipeline can set off meltdown. It is a time we regard nuclear power plant and storage facility as security risk. Nuclear security is not an issue where the president should lead from behind. In the case of a nuclear accident here or any other country, you can be sure the government and nuclear power industry reaction will be mirrors Japan's. They will control all information and access to the nuclear site, claiming national security concerns. The right to keep information from the public after disaster must be a privilege for the government, not an expectation. We need to establish now what level of access is necessary for scientists reporters, what level of government discretion is necessary for national security. We need a framework for this agreement. For now, this burden lies with investigators, and we are not well organized. Even outside of disaster scenario, there is no link between scientists and the politicians. This is true here in the United States too. I was shocked to learn in the past 2 years how much trouble our top scientists have when contacting senators and congressmen. I didn't find this to be the case 20 years ago. Continuous and open line communication between independent scientists, engineers, journalists, politicians is essential to handling another nuclear disaster effectively. I would like to ask all of you to persuade your government to share with the Japanese government your concern with the potential catastrophe and its international security and health issues. I conclude with 3 proposals for international action. 1, fact-finding mission to Fukushima made up of a select group of lawmakers from the United States, Russia, Ukraine, Germany, England, France, and Canada. Senator Wyden of Oregon set an example by visiting last year. Number 2. Special program established by UNICEF and the WHO to take extra measures to save the children who are being continually exposed to radiation in coming decades. Number 3, mechanism for nuclear scientists and medical doctors to collaborate and develop new technology and medicine to treat illnesses associated with radiation exposures. When Prince Charles of England spoke last year at the Rio Plus 20 conference, he said with regard to climate change, "It is perhaps a trait of human nature to act only when the worst happens. But that is not a trait we can afford to rely on here." He could have been speaking about Fukushima. I will continue to write my blog as a layman with my partner, Chris Cote, excellent man, young man I never met. And I again praise Helen and the New York Academy of Medicine for coordinating this event. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Proceedings from the symposium on the medical consequences of Fukushima, where we have just heard the presentation of Akio Matsumura, the founder of the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders in Japan. This is 5 o'clock Shadow. I'm Robert Knight in New York, and we pause for a moment in our presentation today, covering the breaking events and highlights of the Fukushima Symposium convened by Dr. Helen Caldicott and taking place at the New York Academy of Medicine, to remind our listeners that this kind of coverage and this kind of detail about the ever-present danger of the release of fissile materials into the atmosphere, into the water tables, into the body, where the effects are far more profound than typical measurements that only look at the exterior, the skin, or outside exposure of these isotopes. And for WBAI and Pacifica Radio to be able to present this kind of information that goes counter to the corporate propaganda and the government collaboration with things like the Price Waterhouse Act and the Price-Anderson Act, and the protection of a dangerous technology that has put the entire world at risk, as Fukushima has demonstrated. We need to be here on these airwaves at 99.5 megahertz FM, and to do that, at this particular time, it is urgent that our listeners come to the aid of this non-commercial radio station of the Pacifica Foundation, because we are facing a significant financial deadline in order to not be evicted from the transmitter location at the antenna atop the Empire State Building. And over the past few days and weeks, the response to keeping WBAI, pardon the expression, radio active is for you to call area code 516-620-3602. Area code 516-620-3602. That is our pledge center, where without the influence of corporations, without people buying our words and dictating our content, we depend only on you. No grants, no thing other than what any public radio station is entitled to through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But that is not by any means what we need. What we need is to complete our fund drive with $500,000 by the end of this month. We face a crucial moment on the 15th of March in regard to the transmitter. Our administrative staff has been holding the fort, and now we simply need you to come and populate our coffers so that WBAI continues its broadcast. There is nothing more valuable than this frequency at the middle of the FM band. It was originally a commercial station, Broadcast Associates Incorporated. That's where the call letters come from. And thanks to a generous donation by the owner of that station, we became the second Pacifica Foundation radio station. Well, actually, there's also KPFK in Los Angeles and KPFA, the original station in Berkeley, California. And now, since the 1970s, we have been joined by KPFT in Houston and by WPFW in Washington. There are 500,000 so-called internet radio stations, but the broadcast on the terrestrial FM band is something that cannot be replaced. And we want you to call 516-620-3602. We have opened up a special emergency transmitter fund, and we're hoping that you will call and support the existence of WBAI at the rate of at least $100. I'm hoping that there are academics and scholars and people concerned about health consequences of the environment who might today pledge at the $300 rate. But in any case, it's so urgent that we maintain our transmitter, and this is the moment of action or loss. If we are impecunious and unable to maintain our presence there, we won't be coming back. It is a monumental fortune that we are here at this broadcast frequency, and we hope that you'll sustain that so that we can maintain an intellectual, moral, political community that is WBAI. So please continue those calls and make the debt resolution a happy process. 516-620-3602. We have had difficulty with the Hurricane Sandy, the flooding of Wall Street, and the mildewing, the incapacitation of our phones at our old location at 120 Wall Street. And we are now at WHCR at the City College at 137th Street between Convent and Amsterdam, and preparing a great opportunity for reducing that burdensome rent that is characteristic of New York, and hopefully obtaining our own building. Those steps are in the works, and you are sustaining a viable future for WBAI. So thank you for calling, and please quickly be generous and help us acquit the financial responsibility as we prepare to return to the information process that is our commitment here at WBAI. Thank you so much, and please keep those calls coming at 516-620-3602. This is 5 O'Clock Shadow. I'm Robert Knight in New York, and this week marks not only the second anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster at the Daiichi Units 1, 2, 3, and 4, but it is also a milestone from the time of 1942 with the first documented nuclear fission that was intentionally done in Chicago, that there was released into the world a new hazard, a radioactive isotope of cesium, cesium-137, that has a half-life of some 30 years. And that is the focus of a presentation at the Fukushima Medical Symposium that was presented by Steve Starr. He's with the Clinical Laboratory Science Program at the University of Missouri, and he speaks about the implications of massive radiation contamination of Japan with radioactive cesium.
A large number of highly radioactive isotopes released by the destruction of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant grossly contaminated the Japanese mainland. Most of these radionuclides had short half-lives, which meant they would essentially disappear in a matter of days or months. For many of those who were exposed to them, there will be major health consequences. However, there are some radioactive elements that will not rapidly disappear, and it is these long-lived radionuclides that will remain to negatively affect the health of all complex life forms that are exposed to them. Chief among them is cesium-137, which has taken on special significance because it's proven to be the most abundant of the long-lived radionuclides that has remained in the environment following the nuclear disasters of Chernobyl and Fukushima. It has a 30-year radioactive half-life, which is why it persists in the environment. Scientists now believe that it will be 180 to 320 years before the cesium-137 around the destroyed Chernobyl reactor actually disappears from the environment. Cesium is water-soluble and quickly makes its way into soils and waters. It is the same atomic family as potassium, and it mimics it, acting as a macronutrient. It quickly becomes ubiquitous in contaminated ecosystems. It is distributed by the catastrophic accidents at nuclear power plants because large quantities of volatile radioactive cesium build up inside the fuel rods of nuclear reactors. Thus, any accident at a nuclear reactor that causes the fuel rods to rupture, melt, or burn will cause the release of radioactive cesium gas. Long-lived radionuclides, such as cesium-137, are something new to us as a species. They did not exist on Earth in any appreciable quantities during the entire evolution of complex life. Although they are invisible to our senses, they are millions of times more poisonous than most of the common poisons we are familiar with. They cause cancer, leukemia, genetic mutations, birth defects, malformations, and abortions at concentrations almost below human recognition and comprehension. They are lethal at the atomic or molecular level. They emit radiation, invisible forms of matter and energy that we might compare to fire, because radiation burns and destroys human tissue. But unlike the fire of fossil fuels, the nuclear fire that issues forth from radioactive elements cannot be extinguished. It is not a fire that can be scattered or suffocated, because it burns at the atomic level. It comes from the disintegration of single atoms. Thus, radioactivity is a term which indicates how many radioactive atoms are disintegrating in a time period. We measure the intensity of radioactivity by the rate of disintegrations and the energy they produce. 1 becquerel is equal to 1 atomic disintegration per second. 1 curie is defined as that amount of any radioactive material that will decay at a rate of 37 billion disintegrations per second. So 1 curie equals 37 billion becquerels. Sometimes these man-made radionuclides are compared to naturally occurring radionuclides, such as potassium-40, which is always found in bananas and other fruits. However, this is a false comparison, since naturally occurring radioactive elements are very weakly radioactive. In the charts from the labs that are in green up there, the radioactivity is described as a specific activity. Note that potassium-40 has a specific activity of 71 10-millionths of a curie per gram. Compare that to the 88 curies per gram for cesium-137. It's like comparing a stick of dynamite to an atomic bomb. Highly radioactive fission products such as cesium-137 and strontium-90 emit 10 to 20 million times more radiation per unit volume than does potassium-40. So which one of these would you rather have in your bananas? It is in fact the amount of cesium-137 deposited per square kilometer of land that defines the degree to which an area is classified as being too radioactive to work or live. One may get an idea of the extreme toxicity of cesium-137 by considering how little of it is required to make a large area of land uninhabitable. The lands that were grossly contaminated by the destruction of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant are classified by the number of curies of radiation per square kilometer. There were 3,840 square miles of land contaminated with 15 to 40 curies of radiation per square kilometer. These lands are considered strict radiation dose control zones. The 1,100 square mile uninhabitable exclusion zone that surrounds a destroyed Chernobyl reactor has greater than 40 curies of radioactivity per square kilometer. For those more familiar with square miles, that would be 104 curies per square mile. Consider again that 1 gram of cesium-137 has 88 curies of radioactivity. Thus, as little as 1/3 of a gram of cesium-137 made into microparticles, distributed as a smoke or gas over an area of 1 square kilometer will make that square kilometer uninhabitable. Less than 2 grams of cesium-137, a piece smaller than an American dime, if made into microparticles and evenly distributed over as a radioactive gas over an area of 1 square mile, will turn that square mile into an uninhabitable radioactive exclusion zone. Central Park in New York City can be made uninhabitable by 2 grams of microparticles of cesium-137. Hard to believe, isn't it? Remember, these nuclear poisons are lethal at the atomic level. There are as many atoms in 1 gram of cesium-137 as there are greens. The next two slides were produced by Lawrence Livermore, were presumably given to the Japanese government. On March 14th, the easterly winds which had been blowing the highly radioactive gases and aerosols coming from Fukushima out to sea shifted and pushed the radioactive plume back over the Japanese mainland. You can see the progression. The red indicates the radioactive plume. Note that the images indicate that the plume first went south over Tokyo, and then reversed and went north as the wind changed. All the areas where the radioactive gases passed over were contaminated. However, the heaviest contamination occurred where rainfall where it rained out. And this is accounts for the patchy deposition of the radioactive fallout. 8 months after the disaster, the Japanese Science Ministry released this map. That's the one with the, let's see, it would be on your right, which shows that 11,580 square miles, which is 30,000 square kilometers, which represents 13% of the Japanese mainland, have been contaminated with long-lived radioactive cesium. Note that the official map does not note any cesium-137 contamination in the Tokyo metropolitan area, unlike an unofficial survey done about the same time by Professor Yukio Hayakawa of Gunma University. Given the fact that the Japanese government and TEPCO denied for 2 months that any meltdowns that had occurred at Fukushima, one must look at all official data with a healthy degree of skepticism. 4,500 square miles, or earlier today we were at 7,700 square miles, which is an area larger than the size of Connecticut, was found to have radiation levels that exceeded Japan's previously allowable exposure rate of 1 millisievert per year. Rather than evacuate this area, Japan chose to raise this acceptable radiation exposure rate by 20 times, from 1 millisievert to 20 millisieverts per year. However, approximately 300 square miles adjacent to the destroyed Fukushima reactors were so contaminated they were declared uninhabitable. 159,000 Japanese were evicted from this radioactive exclusion zone, lost their homes, property, and businesses, and most have received only a small compensation to cover the costs of their living as evacuees. Note here that the criteria used for evacuation is the millisievert. It's not a measured quantity of radiation per unit area that I've described, such as the Curie or Becquerel. Rather, the sievert is a calculated quantity. It's calculated to represent the biological effects of ionizing radiation. In other words, the millisievert is a derived number based on the mathematical models which are used to convert the absorbed dose to effective dose. So what is the increased health risk to Japanese based upon their exposure to 20 millisieverts per year? Let's examine the figures constructed on the basis of data published by the National Academy of Sciences. It was provided to me by Ian Gard. The vertical y-axis is calibrated to the number of cancer cases per 100,000 age peers. The horizontal x-axis depicts the age of the population beginning at 0 years and moving towards old age. Examine the allegedly safe dose of 20 millisieverts per year. As a result of this exposure, there will be about 1,000 additional cases of cancer in female infants and 500 cases of cancer in infant boys per 100,000 in their age groups. There will be an additional 100 cases of cancer in 30-year-old males in their age groups. Now, notice that children, especially girls, are at most risk from radiation-induced cancer. In fact, female infant has 7 times greater risk, and a 5-year-old girl has 5 times greater risk of getting a radiation-induced cancer than does a 30-year-old man. I want to note here that there's a great deal of controversy in regards to the accuracy of the methods used to arrive at the millisievert measurement, especially in regard to an accurate determination of the biological effects of an external versus internal exposure to ionizing radiation. That is, the effects of an exposure to a source of ionizing radiation that is external to the body versus an exposure that comes from the ingestion of radionuclides that provide a chronic, long-term internal exposure to living cells, which are adjacent to the radioactive atoms or particles. In the land surrounding Chernobyl and Fukushima, the primary route of internal exposure is through the ingestion of foodstuffs contaminated with cesium-137, which tends to bioaccumulate in plants and animals. What this means is that cesium-137 cannot be excreted faster than it's being ingested. Thus it accumulates and increases in its concentration in the plant or animal that's routinely ingesting it. Cesium-137 also tends to biomagnify as it moves up the food chain. This means it becomes progressively more concentrated in predator species. We've seen this before with other industrial toxins such as DDT, which can magnify its concentration millions of times from the bottom to the top of the food chain. Consequently, all of the foodstuffs in a contaminated region tend to contain cesium-137. Those naturally rich in potassium, such as mushrooms and berries, tend to have very high concentrations. Dairy products and meats also tend to have higher concentrations. The International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP, which sets radiation safety standards, recognizes that cesium-137 bioaccumulates in humans. This ICRP figure compares a single ingestion of 1,000 becquerels of cesium-137, a one-time exposure, with a daily ingestion of 10 becquerels. On a single exposure, notice that half the cesium-137 is gone from the body in 110 days. That's considered the biological half-life. Note also that with a routine daily ingestion of 10 becquerels of cesium-137, the total radioactivity within the body continues to rise until after about 500 days there are more than 1,400 becquerels of radioactivity measured in the body. Becquerels can be counted in living persons because cesium-137, the decay of cesium-137 emits gamma radiation which passes through the body and can be measured by a whole body counter. So they have a chair that kids can sit in, or anyone, and they can calculate the amount of becquerels per kilogram of body weight. So in a 70-kilogram adult, based on this, the total body activity of 1,400 becquerels would correspond to 20 becquerels per kilogram of body weight. And a 20-kilogram child would be 70 becquerels per kilogram of body weight. The ICRP document does not specify the average age or weight of those examined in the study. However, the safety standards that have been set by the nuclear industry do not consider this level of chronic exposure to so-called low-dose radiation to be a significant danger to human health. The ICRP states in this document that a whole body activity of 1,400 becquerels is equivalent to an exposure 1/10 of millisievert per year. In other words, the radiation models used by radiation biologists to convert this level of internal absorbed dose to effective dose do not predict serious health risks from such exposures. In fact, they stated it's safe to have 10 times this exposure level. There is, however, strong evidence that the ingestion of these levels of so-called low-dose radiation are, in fact, particularly injurious to children. Research done by Dr. Yuri Benachevsky and his colleagues and students in Belarus during the correlated whole body radiation levels of 10 to 30 becquerels per kilogram of whole body weight with abnormal heart rhythms and levels of 50 becquerels per kilogram of body weight with irreversible damage to the tissues of the heart and other vital organs. One of the key discoveries made by Banachevsky was that cesium-137 bioconcentrates into endocrine and heart tissues, as well as the pancreas, kidneys, and intestines. This goes completely against one of the primary assumptions used by the ICRP to calculate effective dose as measured by millisieverts. The cesium-137 is uniformly distributed in human tissues. Let me restate that this current ICRP methodology, the current ICRP methodology is to assume that the absorbed dose is uniformly distributed in human tissues. This is, in fact, not the case. A table taken from Baniszewski's chronic cesium-137 incorporation in children's organs compares the radioactivity measured in 13 organs of 6 infants. Very high specific activity, that is, levels of radioactivity, often 10 times higher than in other organs and tissues, were found in the pancreas, thyroid, adrenal glands, heart, and intestinal walls. Baniszewski summarized his 9 years of research in the study entitled Radioactive Cesium in the Heart. With the help of friends, I just finished editing a new Russian-English translation of this work. It was never previously translated, in large part because shortly after Dr. Baniszewski presented it to the Parliament and the President of Belarus, he was summarily arrested and imprisoned. Government agents entered the medical institute which he directed and destroyed his archived slides and samples. After he was released from prison, he was held under house arrest. It was during this time that he actually wrote the study. He did so in an attempt to preserve his research, knowing that he was about to be in prison again for a very long time. Just as Soviet physicians were forbidden to diagnose a radiation-related illness following Chernobyl, the Belarusian government acted to suppress the work of Baniszewski, who had been protesting government efforts to resettle people back into land badly contaminated with cesium-137. In radioactive cesium in the heart, Baniszewski also did a correlation between the amount of cesium-137 in live children and their heart function. He worked with the Belgrade Institute, which conducted more than 100,000 whole body counts on Belarusian children, measuring the amounts of internally ingested cesium-137 in each child. There were so many contaminated children in Belarus that it was difficult to find any with 0 becquerels per kilogram. However, only those with less than 10 becquerels per kilogram of body weight had normal electrocardiograms. 35% of the children with 11 to 37 becquerels per kilogram had normal ECGs. 20% of children with 37 to 74 becquerels per kilogram had normal ECGs, and only 11% of those with 74 to 100 becquerels per kilogram had normal ECGs. This slide, which shows the average results from hundreds of autopsies done during 1997, is also taken from radioactive cesium in the heart. Notice the very high concentration of cesium-137 in the thyroid gland. While we generally worry about radioactive iodine concentrating in the thyroid, Baniszewski's work shows us that cesium-137 is likely to play a major role in thyroid cancer too. I want to point out again that the currently accepted medical and legal understanding of cesium-137 is that it is, quote, distributed fairly uniformly, unquote, in human tissues. I copied the webpage from the U.S. EPA website from which this quote is taken. Clearly, the autopsy human tissue samples analyzed by Baniszewski show that this is not the case. This new understanding needs to be incorporated into the way we understand how internally ingested radionuclides act upon the human body. 2 million people in Belarus live on land severely contaminated by cesium-137. Most of the children who live there are not considered to be healthy, although they were before the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl exploded. 14 years after the explosion, 45 to 40% of high school graduates had physical disorders, including gastrointestinal anomalies, weakened hearts, and cataracts, and 40% were diagnosed with chronic blood disorders and malfunctioning thyroids. I'm afraid that there are many Japanese people now living on lands equally contaminated with radioactive cesium. If Japanese children are allowed to routinely ingest foodstuffs contaminated with cesium-137, they will likely develop the same health problems that we see now in the children and teenagers of Belarus and Ukraine. Thus, it's very important that we recognize the danger posed to children by the routine ingestion of contaminated food with cesium-137, wherever they might live. It's also important to prevent further nuclear disasters which release these fiendishly toxic poisons into the global ecosystems. Given the immense amounts of long-lived radionuclides which exist at every nuclear power plant, this is an urgent task. I hope I've made it clear that long-lived radionuclides produced by nuclear power plants are neither safe nor clean. Would suggest that it is a very bad idea to manufacture these nuclear poisons to try to make electricity. That it's past time we stop manufacturing them and try to manage those which we have already created, which must be isolated from the ecosystems for at least 100,000 years.
And That was Stephen Starr of the University of Missouri's Clinical Laboratory Science Program speaking at the Fukushima Medical Consequences Symposium at the New York Academy of Medicine. The symposium convened by Dr. Helen Caldicott, the Caldicott Foundation, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. And that concludes today's coverage of this major event taking place on the second anniversary of the nuclear disaster at Fukushima Daiichi Units 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'd like to thank, for the production of the programs this week, the Pacifica National Technical Staff, including John Almella and Otis McClay. Here at WBAI, we appreciate the engineering and operations of Michael G. Haskins, Reggie Johnson, Grayson Schallinger, Sean Rhodes, and Kathy Davis, our Public Affairs Director. Also, KPFA with its Flashpoints program with Dennis Bernstein, and most of all, you, the listener, for sustaining and supporting this independent Pacifica non-commercial radio station. We welcome your comments at an email to The Shadow. That's theshadow@wbai.org. And for 5 o'clock Shadow, I'm Robert Knight in New York. And for those who might have been enlightened by the presentations on the Fukushima Nuclear Medical Consequences Conference, that is the subject of all of our coverage in this week's edition of 5 o'clock Shadow, we urge you to support WBAI and maintain its continuity with a contribution to the WBAI Emergency Transmitter Fund with a pledge call, a tax-deductible pledge to the WBAI Pledge Center at area code 516-620-3602. That's 516-620-3602. Thank you for listening.
E quando sono a New York ascolto WBAI su 99.5 FM.
Vytvořila plynule kapote, důle skakala, že neseděla tlucování minutí na repinu Jolanda, bude moc zvázat.
Quando sono a New York ascolto sempre perché radio sintonizzato 29.5 WBAI.
What language do you speak when you call back home and talk to your grandmother or cousins? Join WBAI's ongoing community outreach and produce a station ID for us in your native tongue. You can contact the program coordinator, Michael G. Haskins, at wbaiannouncements@gmail.com. Let's celebrate each other.
Once again, you're tuned to 99.5 FM WBAI and WBAI.org on the web. And we want to get a few more of you to pledge your support to WBAI in the form of a pledge for the BAI Transmitter Fund. The WBAI Transmitter Fund. Just say Transmitter Fund when you call 516-620-3602. 516-620-3602. Listeners have been calling in throughout this last hour, throughout this afternoon. 516-620-3602 for the transmitter fund, and it's fantastic. A listener called me this morning at about 6:30 in the morning. I couldn't take the call, but I listened to the message, and she was like panicked. She was saying, there is this conference going on, and Helen Caldecott is at this conference, and BAI should be covering this conference. And I listened to it and tried to figure out what conference she was saying, because I knew there was a conference taking place, and I knew we were involved. I knew Dennis Bernstein was in town covering it, and I knew Robert Knight was there covering it, and I knew some other folks were covering it as well. But she was really upset because she had heard nothing about it. And I said, well, for sure, if you tune into 5 o'clock Shadow, there will be extensive coverage on that. So I just want to let you know that that's what we do here at this radio station. You're not hearing about Helen Caldecott speaking at this conference anywhere else on the radio dial, but you are hearing about it on WBAI. That is what we do, and we so appreciate you. See, you are the ones, the listeners, those of you listening right now, you're the ones that make this possible. All right. It's time for the news. Please stay tuned for a report of some of the day's events with the WBAI News Team.
Good evening. In the news today, public school closures, a new way to fight rats on the New York City subway system, a challenge to New Jersey's teen curfew law, and the nuclear crisis 2 years after the Fukushima disaster. With these and other stories, I'm Linda Perry in New York, and this is the news for Tuesday, March 12, 2013. New York's Department of Education panel voted to approve the closure of 22 public schools for what they claim is low performance. The vote came despite 4 members submitting a proposal to withdraw the current plan, which would have placed a moratorium on the closings. In Manhattan, the DOE's plan for closure includes the High School of Graphic Communication Arts, the Choir Academy of Harlem, the Bread and Roses Integrated Arts High School, and Jackie Robinson. Among schools set to be phased out in the Bronx are PS 50, Clara Barton, PS 64, Pora Belpre, MS 142, John Philip Sousa. Brooklyn was the hardest hit by the plan, with 8 schools facing phase-outs or closure. They include the George Gershwin and the Rafael Cordero Junior Highs, Sheepshead Bay High School, and the General D. Chappie James Middle School of Science. The Borough of Queens is scheduled to see phase-outs at the Law, Government, and Community Service High School and the Business Computer Applications and Entrepreneurship High School. Under the Bloomberg administration, 142 schools have been shut down or approved for phase-out since 2002, when the mayor came to office. At a preliminary budget hearing of City Council's Committee on Public Safety today, Police Commissioner Ray Kelly testified that the NYPD continues to be understaffed and overburdened. He reiterated concern over illegal weapons, which should be taken off the streets and out of the hands of the city's youth. Brooklyn Councilmember Jumaane Williams agrees. He says it would be best if they worked cooperatively.
16-year-olds should not be walking around with guns. The young people should not be walking around with guns.
Victims in this city, unfortunately, are people
I understand that. I've gone to the funerals where you have not.
What are we doing about
so I know what they look like. I have done a lot about it. And what I would like to see in the budget is impact budget zones, just the same way we have impact. The only response that we can get is police officers. I like to see more responses. I like to see more budget. I like to see more resources. I like to talk to you about policing the community in a manner that's respectful and get to where you want to go. I am very adamant about getting guns off the street. I co-chair the Gun Violence Task Force in the City Council. We've proposed some things. Thankfully, it's been funded. But if we work together, it will be better than if we work adversarially.
Councilmember Jumaane Williams. Manhattan Transportation Authority officials are considering curbing the growing number of rodents in New York City's subway system with a product that induces sterility in female rats. The agency is working with an Arizona-based company that has used contrapest in agricultural areas of Southeast Asia. Transit officials say the product poses no threats to other animals, crops, or humans and does not leach into water. It will be placed in bait boxes in a handful of subway trash rooms. The New Jersey chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union has filed suit against the village of Wbai, challenging that municipality's teen curfew law. Teenagers in that village and their parents in some cases face fines and community service time if they are caught outside between 10 p.m. and 5:30 a.m. The ACLU lawsuit is on behalf of 17-year-old community college student Shayna Harris, who was cited last September for walking across the street from her home after 10 p.m. to buy a milkshake at a fast food restaurant. WBAI's Jose Santiago discussed the case with Ed Barakis, legal director for the ACLU of New Jersey.
The juvenile curfew here in Wbai violates both the juvenile's rights as well as the parents' rights. Here we have a person, a college student actually, who was arrested for simply walking across the street to get a milkshake at a Burger King because it was after 10 o'clock. All of us have the right to travel, to go to a friend's house, to do what we wish. And even if you're 16 or 17, you still have that right and can't be denied it by the government. A parent can decide to give a child a curfew. And if that curfew is violated, the parent can decide on what the punishment should be. But the government cannot override, cannot insert itself into the role of parent and actually reject what the parent has decided and instead impose its own curfew and discipline on juveniles.
What are the limitations? What are the terms of this curfew?
Well, the curfew basically bans almost all activity for anyone under the age of 18 between 10 at night and 5:30 in the morning. It basically tells them, go to your room and stay there. So if a person, and again, here we're dealing with someone who received her high school diploma when she was 16 and was now in college at the time that this happened, if she had walked 5 blocks down the street to meet a friend and walked home at 10:30, or had a study group and walked home at 10:30, or here went out to a fast food restaurant or to a supermarket, they would essentially, under Waunaqu's juvenile curfew, be breaking the law.
And what is the penalty? And who is the penalty against? The parents, the young people?
Well, the penalty is against the juvenile, but it also can be against the parent as well. It's a fine, it's community service, and it increases each time a person is found in violation of the ordinance. You know, here we have a situation where Shayna's mother was comfortable with her going out to Burger King or to the Stop and Shop. She was comfortable with her being a college student at that age. Surely she could be comfortable with her crossing the street to get something to eat. What the government's really doing here is imposing itself against the will of the parent. The parent has the right to decide, I trust my child, I believe she's responsible enough to do this or that, whatever it might be. And here, actually, Shayna had received permission from a parent to go across the street before she did so.
I'm assuming the curfew was imposed because the authorities there might have had issues with young people out, maybe vandalism or whatever. But do we know if these curfews actually work?
Well, what's interesting is all that this curfew does is criminalize innocent behavior, because Waunaque or any other town already has the ability to arrest people, whether they're young people or adults, for vandalism or trespassing or any other similar actual offense. All that this juvenile curfew does is criminalize innocent behavior and take police resources away from what actually could be useful. instead what it does is funnel our young people into the criminal justice system when they shouldn't be.
And my understanding is curfews like this have been imposed in other towns, but shot down. What's the history?
So the ACLU of New Jersey challenged juvenile curfews back approximately a decade ago, and they were shot down by the courts. In those instances, the courts said that the language of the curfews were too vague, so that it didn't give an accurate explanation to people on what was allowed or what wasn't. What we're doing now raises that vagueness issue, but it's also a direct challenge to these curfews, just as basic violations of the right of juveniles to be free, as well as the right of a parent to decide how to rear their child as they think appropriate, and to set curfews as they think appropriate.
So you filed the lawsuit. What's next?
What's next is we filed for an injunction against Wanacue enforcing their ordinance, and we don't have a date yet, but date will be set for that argument, hopefully in short order. We will try to get an injunction so that if Shana Harris wants to go across the street to get a milkshake at 10:30, or if her mother wants to send her to the supermarket down the street to get milk or bread at night, or if Shana wants to wake up early in the morning to go for a jog before going off to college classes, she'll be able to do so.
Ed Baracus is legal director with the New Jersey chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. He spoke with WBAI's Jose Santiago. And you're listening to the news on WBAI in New York, listener-sponsored non-commercial Pacifica Radio, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and WBAI.org. 2 years after the nuclear crisis in Japan, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says American nuclear power plants are safer than ever, though not trouble-free. Watchdog groups call that assessment overly rosy. Members of the scientific and medical profession call it nonsense. In a recent report, NRC Commissioner Allison McFarland says all but 5 of the nation's 104 nuclear reactors were performing at acceptable safety levels at the end of 2012. But the Union of Concerned Scientists issued a scathing report saying nearly 1 in 6 U.S. nuclear reactors experienced safety breaches last year, due in part to weak oversight. The group accused the NRC of tolerating the intolerable. And in New York, a symposium addressing medical and ecological consequences of Fukushima concludes today. Dr. Andrew Cantor is with Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Conference is extremely important because what it is doing is drawing attention to the medical, public health, and ecological consequences of Fukushima, but in the context of the history from Chernobyl, and hopefully to provide a broader understanding of what the impact